Hello! Today I'm returning to the world and story of Final Fantasy X with a look at two of its central characters, Tidus and Yuna. Now, having recently discussed Sin, which is obviously a very unique and interpretable feature of the game, it raised some comments and observations around the wider themes of Final Fantasy X, and I think a good way to broach this topic is by looking at the central characters, because I think many Final Fantasy games, when we look at the central party, and particularly the types of dialogues and escalating interactions between the central romantic leads, it's a very intriguing and interesting vehicle towards understanding the thematic intent, or at least some of the thematic intent, of a given Final Fantasy game. And for example, whether it's Squall exclaiming that he never wants to be discussed in the past tense, or Cloud Strife stuck between two female leads in his muddled Cloud Zack persona, or even Zidane assisting Garnet's transformation into the more common and autonomous Dagger, there's often little segues and scenarios and details that speak to a wider whole within key character interactions. And as James Joyce once wrote, in the particular lies the universal, which I think is quite fitting for how themes and meanings play out in seemingly small situations within the Final Fantasy stories. So, along with discussing Tidus and Yuna, their status within and contributions to the story of Final Fantasy X, I think it's a good opportunity to look at these broader themes as well. And jumping right in, I think the reason it's worth discussing Tidus and Yuna in tandem, rather than individually, is because looking at the story, they are so interrelated in how they propel the archetypal hero journey forwards, with Tidus carrying the personal plight with his unresolved father issues and entering the new unknown world, and Yuna carrying the macro arc of the story with her pilgrimage to save the world, her self-sacrifice, and her own pursuits against the more macro villain Seymour, and so on. And indeed, I've mentioned before that the hero role in Final Fantasy X does feel very evenly split between these two characters, and rather than fostering some romantic conclusion for its own sake, where one is the primary hero and the other assists them but is largely a love interest, what we have here is two characters with two personal agendas, and indeed two personal nemesis to overcome, with Jecht on the one hand and Seymour and Sin on the other. And what these characters find is that the best way, and perhaps the only way, they can overcome these obstacles is with the support of the other. So I found it remarkable how well this story was constructed and how much balance is given to both of these leads. Yuna's successes would never have occurred without Tidus taking her off the well-trodden path of the Summoner's Pilgrimage, and Tidus would have never overcome his issues with his father without Yuna. So they are sun and moon, yin and yang, and two sides of the same coin, contributing equally to the wider whole of the story. And where Yuna starts off insecure and shy about her ability to live up to expectations, and Tidus starts off brash and uncompromising in his views on his father, it is only by interaction with one another that they overcome these personal hurdles, and both stories reconciling at a single point at the end of the game, in the form of Sin. It was just really good structure and really sound narrative design in my opinion. So that's the intriguing dual protagonist arc of Final Fantasy X in a nutshell, I think. But turning to the thematic implications of the game, it's very interesting to see how these play out within this hero's journey, and in ancillary ways among the wider party and characters in Spira. And kicking off with the themes identified in Final Fantasy X, a recurring one that's often discussed is religion, which is clearly a component of the story, and a very important one that shapes the world and setting. But personally, I never found that factor to be a definitive essence or overriding theme of Final Fantasy X, but rather another vehicle, like the characters, towards delivering on the themes and understanding its themes, which I'll touch on shortly. The other themes commonly identified are firstly grief, loss, and perhaps more specifically death, which I find myself agreeing with. Love is often mentioned, as love is considered the antithesis to death for many. Nature and technology, to a lesser extent, yes, and that's something that recurs in most Final Fantasy games in the subtext. And also free will versus hard determinism, which is another thing that plays out in quite a lot of Final Fantasy games actually, but certainly more so in Final Fantasy X than others, I think. And again, I'll touch on that shortly. But the way religion and the plot device of Yevon plays very well into these themes is that almost every religion, by definition, has some sort of explanation, coping mechanism, and perception of death. And indeed, some religions entirely hinge around it. And equally, almost every religion has some sort of guiding principles, rules, or philosophies on living life and moral conduct within a civilized society, which is often tied to expectations around death and after death. So that's how I think Yevon helps deliver on these themes, and Tidus and Yuna's great schism, breaking away from the principles of Yevon, refusing to accept death, is a major change in the story's trajectory, and one that has a lot of thematic weight to it, which I'll get into now. So, looking first at the theme of grief and death, it's pervasive in this game, and indeed the aforementioned sin is the harbinger of endless death, the very foundation of Spyran society, which has led to the formation of Yevon, and thus a rather subdued and stunted culture that is resigned to the cycle of death, and this is the backdrop against which we play the game. So yes, grief, death, loss, kind of baked into the setting here. Turning more specifically to Tidus and Yuna, we have two characters experiencing grief and coping with their own experiences of death, and an earlier comment suggested many Final Fantasy X characters, such as you, Yevon, reacting badly and destructively in his grief by creating sin, or Seymour Guado becoming twisted because of his mother's death, and even Wakka indiscriminately hating the Al Bhed. These are signs of a sort of bad grief, if you like, while Tidus and Yuna are emblematic of a more positive application of grief, that contributes to their heroism. And that's an interesting point, and I'd agree with it to an extent, but actually I'd suggest in the beginning of the game, independently of one another, Tidus and Yuna are not in this positive heroic state at all, but actually they are in the grip of their own destructive grief in their own respective ways, and actually the arc of Final Fantasy X is them evolving out of that into a form of acceptance. For his part, Tidus has the abandonment issues and contempt for his father, which stems more specifically from the death of his mother, and Yuna, who's coping with the death of her own father, Lord Braska. And interestingly, both of these characters, as part of their coping, emulate their father figures. One's a Blitzball star and the other becomes a summoner, almost as if they're filling the void with something reminiscent of this absent figure. And thinking about it now, I suppose we could even argue that the characters' personal arcs follow the 7 stages of grief, which includes denial, anger, depression, before finally arriving at acceptance. We could view them this way, and, for example, Tidus is definitely in the flux of denial, anger, at his mother's passing, and he's kind of projecting and squarely blaming this on his father. And Yuna, along with the other denizens of Spira, are more in this subdued, perpetual depressive state, which is, lamenting the constant loss of their loved ones. And just to explore and emphasise this point a bit further, and looking at some examples of the wider party who echo this theme of grief, we have Wakka and Lulu, who are grieving the loss of Chapu, and Wakka in particular is interesting in how he too exhibits this anger and denial, blaming everything on the Al Bhed for starters, and then passing the Brotherhood sword onto Tidus and stating that, he looks like his brother. So there's almost this denial and projection and emulation that he sees in Tidus, which obviously makes Lulu quite angry. And also we have Auron, who at first glance seems more stoic and seemingly detached from the others, and certainly emotionally. But if we consider the fact that he's unsent, he's literally refusing to die because he won't accept what has happened to him and what has happened to his friend, we can see that grief is prevalent in Final Fantasy X, and for many characters it's what propels them forwards. It's why they feature so prominently in the game and have such a strong disposition one way or the other towards sin, towards Yevon, towards the state of things. So I think we could argue that the other side of grief is acceptance, and by the end of the game we can see that this is largely achieved, whether it's Wakka's enlightenment by being around Riku and indeed Yuna, or Auron's fulfillment at guiding his friend's progeny away from the doomed pursuit of the Summoner's Pilgrimage, and of course Tidus calling Jecht Dad, saying that he's glad he's his father, and tearfully saying, "I hate you," which is a beautiful moment because he's clearly actually saying, "I love you." we reach these outcomes and resolutions, and that's not to say that death goes away forever, but the personal grief suffered by our characters and the looming spectre of sin is vanquished, which is a form of redemption, enlightenment, and acceptance, I think, in quite a significant way. So, closely bound up to the themes of grief, death, acceptance, we have arguments around free will and determinism, and I suppose the calibre of acceptance that the game argues for, because one might reasonably argue, as Maester Micah does in the middle of the game, that Yevon preaches a form of acceptance, and that hope, although it's baseless hope, is a valid coping mechanism for life under the thrall of sin. But conversely, and what Tidus and Yuna's journey advocates, is that Yevon's brand of acceptance is not acceptance at all. It is resignation. It is not positive or progressive change, but rather stagnation. And this is once again the crucial element of Yuna's journey, where thanks to Tidus, she assumes a more assertive and self-determinate outlook, and states something along the lines of, one day I'll conquer sorrow, but I'll do this without false hope, without Yevon. So for the fans that enjoy an existential reading of Final Fantasy games, we could argue that this is the God is dead moment, the collective enlightenment, at least within the party, that has superseded the reliance on an accepted faith in favour of free will. And I found that Yuna's story, beyond her personal growth and renewed individualism, it can certainly be read that way. Now, looking comparatively to Tidus, and just to counter this idea of free will, or at least propose an alternative view, because I think many Final Fantasy games are interpretable, and that's what makes them so interesting. Now, while he is certainly the catalyst to Yuna's free will, if we account for the faith, and the fact that the faith have made a concerted effort to conjure Tidus, with the sole aim of defeating Yu Yevon and Sin, could we suppose that this is contrary to the idea of free will? And though unaware and seemingly sporadic in his actions, his affections, and his animosities around Yuna and her pilgrimage, Tidus is on a preordained path, and indeed he succeeds on this path that the faith have intended for him. So whether you want to read this as fatedness, or chance, or free will, or determinism, I think it's an interesting element of the game that slots kind of neatly or uncomfortably into either one of those arguments. Now, looking to the conclusions drawn and the reading of these themes that are explored in Final Fantasy X, I think this is also interesting, and again, I think it's up to interpretation, because there's multiple elements of the game that may attest to different things to different people. For example, one thing I've mentioned way back in my Final Fantasy VIII review was how there's a certain conciliatory, cathartic view of death in both Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy VII, if we account for the far plane and the life stream. And in the case of the far plane, there's this illusory post-death image of loved ones, and it's naturally something that's intended to ease grief. And as we see in the game, Wakka and others are consoled by images of dead family and so on. And that, I think, can be viewed either way, because the image of the dead is intangible. It doesn't provide insight, it doesn't assist or change or do anything to ease one's worldly woes. And so arguably, like Yevon, it's an empty and baseless hope that doesn't bring true acceptance or anything like that. So over time, my personal opinions about how grief and death is packaged in Final Fantasy X has changed quite a lot, because way back in that Final Fantasy VIII review, I was positing the far plane as a sort of positive thing, but now I'm not really so sure, having returned to the game a few more times. So, moving on, as I say, there's a lot of existential readings that go on with Final Fantasy games, and particularly the games that were made in the latter 1990s, up to and including 10, which was released in 2001. The games were pretty heavy on this stuff, particularly ideas around free will and stuff like that. But looking at Final Fantasy X, I find there's also perhaps more strongly a Buddhist leaning to it, which I've touched on before regarding this game. But to delve into it a bit more thoroughly is that if we look at the tenets of Buddhism, the belief that the essence of existence is impermanence, suffering, and non-self, by which they mean the absence of an immortal soul, this can quite reasonably be applied to the arc of Final Fantasy X, again, chiefly seen through the characters of Tidus and Yuna. For example, on the concept of suffering, in Buddhist belief, everyone is doomed to suffer. However, upon achieving enlightenment or awakening, which is tied to this concept of nirvana, one is able to transcend and accept that suffering rather than be resigned to it. So rather than looking at Yuna's abandonment of Yevon as an existential grasp at free will, it could equally be viewed as the Buddhist concept of awakening. And literally, as I'm saying these words, I've just remembered that Yuna's ultimate weapon is called nirvana. So there we go, perhaps there is a bit more to it. Moving on to the idea of impermanence, which is tied to acceptance and tied to grief. This is where it gets interesting, because I think it has a lot to do with the ending of Final Fantasy X. And most characters in Final Fantasy X have lost people, and most of them, particularly in the central party, eventually accept it in a positive way, whether it's Wakka or Auron or whoever. But the conclusive and climactic vision of impermanence and acceptance is again tied to our heroes of Tidus and Yuna, and it comes with the demise of Tidus in the end game. And I watched this back recently, and it really is a brutal and beautifully constructed scene. And for me, and several others, I think, this is the definitive thematic moment in Final Fantasy X, particularly around these ideas of grief, acceptance, impermanence, and death. And over the course of the game, Yuna has achieved enlightenment. She has achieved nirvana. She has accepted sorrow and loss as part of life. And yet now she is confronted with it in the person that she loves the most. And in retrospect, although it was shocking at the time, it feels like everything naturally built towards this moment. And after Tidus's demise, we have order restored. It made sense. And while it could be seen as tragic in a romantic sense, looking at the game as a love story, in a Buddhist sense or a naturalistic sense, it was actually perfectly fitting and perfectly in keeping with the broader themes of this game, I think. And on this note, and this is a bit beyond the remit of this conversation, but just this morning I had a comment on a recent episode stating that Square has become emotionally juvenile by shying away from character deaths. Thought that was quite a funny comment, but yeah, I understand that sentiment. And even looking back to Final Fantasy X, we have this beautiful conclusiveness and statement about the finiteness of being with Tidus's demise, and yet Square decided to leave the door open for Tidus's return. And I know that many fans wanted the romantic leads to have a happy ever after, and they're pushing for Aerith and Tidus and Zack and everyone to live. But that's what's so beautiful about these original game installments. And that's why the ending has impact, because Yuna and Tidus are deprived of that happy ever after. And it just hammers home the reality of grief in a very real way, but also, ultimately, the necessity and the need for that acceptance, which is what Yuna finally attains. So, there we have it, a short look at some themes in Final Fantasy X through the lens of its two most important characters. If you got this far, thanks very much for listening, I hope you enjoyed it. And drop a comment below, share your thoughts on Tidus, Yuna, and the thematic arc of Final Fantasy X.